Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I shall deal with the novel Jane Eyre in 2 lecture sessions. In this first section, I shall deal with the life and literary career of Charlotte Bronte and acquaint you with a brief outline of the plot of the novel Jane Eyre. In section 2, I shall deal with the autobiographical elements in the novel, Jane Eyre as Bildungsroman, Jane Eyre as a Gothic and psychological novel, and finally analyze some of the major characters in the novel. In August 1847, an unknown author, Currer Bell, published a novel that was to become an immediate bestseller and an enduring classic. Currer Bell was the pen name of Charlotte Bronte, and the title of her novel was Jane Eyre. The novel was acclaimed by both public and critics and set literary London speculating about its author. Who was Currer Bell? Charlotte Bronte, or Currer Bell, was a woman of powerful personality. Outwardly, she seemed the very picture of the proper Victorian lady, but her passionate nature, keen intellect and unusual upbringing would not permit her to be merely conventional. Born in Thornton, Yorkshire, on 21st April 1816, Charlotte Bronte was the third of the 6 children of Maria Branwell and Patrick Bronte. Patrick Bronte was an Irish man who settled in England, changed the spelling of his name and became an Anglican clergyman in the Church of England. In 1820, her family moved a few miles to the village of Haworth. Her mother died of cancer on 15th September 1821, leaving 5 daughters, Maria, Elizabeth, Charlotte, Emily, Anne, and a son Branwell, to be taken care of by her sister Elizabeth Branwell. The parsonage at Haworth was set in the midst of the grey, cold, windy Yorkshire moorlands. The stark landscape outside and the rather gloomy atmosphere inside the house forced the children to devise their own world of pleasure and fun. In 1826, their father's gift of a set of wooden soldiers inspired them to create the complex imaginary worlds of Angria and Gondel. The children peopled their exotic storyland with romantic characters who did exciting things. They loved to tell one another stories about Angria and its people, and as they grew older, they began to write strange tales about their fabled country. Charlotte and Branwell continued with the kingdom of Angria, while Emily and Anne created a separate world of Gondel. The Bronte sisters were inspired by romantic writers of their time, like Sir Walter Scott, William Wordsworth, and Lord Byron. The fanciful and melodramatic vein of authors like Charles Dickens and Walter Scott had a deep impact on Charlotte's writings. In August 1824, Patrick Bronte sent Charlotte, Emily, Maria, and Elizabeth to the clergy daughter school at Cowan Bridge in Lancashire. Maria and Elizabeth soon became ill and returned home and died the following year. Lowood Institution, where Jane Eyre spent 8 years, is believed to be modelled on Cowan Bridge, and the pathetic death of Helen Burns bears resemblance to the death of Maria Bronte. After the deaths of her older sisters, her father removed Charlotte and Emily from the school. In 1831, Charlotte attended Miss Wooler's school at Roe Head, and later she returned there as an instructor. It is said that while at Roe Head, Charlotte heard the shocking but interesting story of a gentleman of the neighborhood who had married a young governess before it was discovered that his mad first wife was living in concealment. The next few years she spent in the homes of families where she worked as a governess. In 1844, when her father's sight was failing, she returned to the parsonage. One day, she found some poems that Emily had written, and it turned out that all three sisters had been writing poetry. In 1846, at their own expense, and under their pseudonyms Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell, they published a volume of verse that sold but 2 copies. Jane Eyre, published in 1847, was an immediate success and rapidly went through 3 editions. Shirley, a historical novel of the Yorkshire mill life and Luddites disturbances, was published at the end of the year 1849. In 1853, Charlotte published her masterpiece, Villette. The following year, that is in the year 1854, at the age of 38, she married her father's curate, the Reverend Bell Nichols. But she died after an illness incidental to childbirth the following year. The Professor, her first written novel, was published posthumously in 1857. Emma, her unfinished novel, was also published posthumously in 1860. She also authored a number of poems. Characters in Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is the protagonist of the novel. Mrs. Reed is her aunt. John Reed, Eliza Reed and Georgiana Reed are the cousins of Jane. Mr. Brocklehurst is the clergyman, director and treasurer of Lowood School. Maria Temple is the kind superintendent of Lowood School. Helen Burns is Jane's best friend at Lowood School. Edward Fairfax Rochester is a Byronic hero and the master of Thornfield Hall. Bertha Antoinette Mason is the insane first wife of Edward Rochester. Richard Mason, an Englishman from the West Indies and Bertha's brother. Mrs. Alice Fairfax is an elderly kind widow and the housekeeper of Thornfield Hall. Adele Varens is an excitable French child to whom Jane is governess at Thornfield Hall. Grace Poole is Bertha Mason's caretaker. Diana Rivers is St. John's sister and Jane's cousin. Mary Rivers is also St. John's sister and Jane's cousin. St. John Eyre Rivers is a clergyman who befriends Jane and turns out to be her cousin. Jane Eyre is Jane's paternal uncle. Blanche Ingram is a woman whom Mr. Rochester temporarily courts. Mr. Lloyd is a compassionate apothecary. Bessie Lee is the nursemaid at Gateshead. Miss Abbott, Miss Catcherd, Mr. Briggs, Robert Leven, Colonel Dent and others are the minor characters in the novel. Now the plot outline of Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre, an autobiography, is the first-person narrative told from the perspective of a female. It opens with the narrator, the adult Jane Eyre, recalling her childhood experiences growing up as an orphan at Gateshead Hall, the home of her unfriendly aunt Mrs. Reed. There she lives with her aunt Sarah Reed and her 2 female cousins Georgiana and Eliza and their brother John. Jane's maternal uncle Mr. Reed is the only one in the Reed family to be kind to Jane, but he soon dies. In the absence of her kind uncle Reed, who has already passed away, the hapless 10-year-old is ill-treated by her aunt and cousins, especially John, who torments and bullies her. Jane's only ally in the household is the nursemaid, Bessie, who would often tell her stories and sing for her. She seeks solace in her doll and books. However, an incident occurs which changes the course of her life. One day, John finds Jane reading one of his books. This enrages him. He snatches the book and hurls it at her. Finding this intolerable, Jane fights back in defiance, only to get into the bad books of her aunt. Mrs. Reed locks her in the red room in which her Uncle Reed died. Terrified, Jane faints out of panic when she imagines that she has seen her uncle's ghost. She is subsequently attended to by the kindly apothecary, Mr. Lloyd. Jane reveals how unhappy she is living at Gateshead Hall. Mr. Lloyd suggests to Mrs. Reed that Jane should be sent to boarding school, an idea to which Mrs. Reed readily agrees. Jane is happy to get away from her present situation and is soon sent to Lowood School, a charity institution for orphan girls. However, there she finds the situation to be far from idyllic. Mr. Brocklehurst, the headmaster, is cruel, hypocritical and abusive. The 80 pupils at Lowood were provided with insufficient food and subjected to cold rooms and thin clothing, while Mr. Brocklehurst uses the school's funds to provide a comfortable life for his own family. Even amid the squalid conditions, there is a silver lining at Lowood. Jane befriends Miss Temple, from whom she learns to be ladylike and compassionate, and Helen Burns, who is a deeply religious girl and has full faith in divine justice. She makes no protest against the ill treatment meted out to her by Miss Scatcherd. Soon a typhus epidemic sweeps Lowood, and Helen dies of consumption. Mr. Brocklehurst is also dismissed from Lowood. Fortunately, Jane's life improves dramatically once more when considerate and sympathetic gentleman takes over as headmaster. Jane spends 8 years in this conducive atmosphere of the school, 6 years as student and 2 years as teacher. After teaching there for 2 years, Jane yearns for newer experiences. Miss Temple marries, and Lowood is not the same for Jane anymore. She applies for the post of a governess in a local newspaper. She gets only one reply from one Mrs. Alice Fairfax of Thornfield, where she has to be a governess to a 10-year-old girl, Adele Varens. Jane readily accepts the job and is warmly welcomed to the comfortable 3-storied country estate by the distinguished housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax. Jane is happy teaching her lively pupil Adele Varens. She likes Thornfield except the mysterious 3rd floor of the manor, where a strange servant, Grace Poole, works uncannily, and from where she hears maniacal laughter from a locked room. One evening, when Jane is out for a walk, she meets a mysterious man when his horse slips and he falls. This is Mr. Rochester, the man of the house, and Adela is his ward. Jane and Rochester are immediately interested in each other. On one occasion, Jane rescues Rochester from a mysterious fire in the latter's room. Jane receives a message that her aunt, Mrs. Reed, who is dying, is calling for her. She returns to Gateshead. Mrs. Reed confesses to Jane that she had wronged her and gives Jane a letter from Jane's paternal uncle, Mr. John Eyre, in which he asks for her to live with him and be his heir. Soon after, Jane's aunt dies and she returns to Thornfield. Here you can see the picture of Thornfield estate. After returning to Thornfield, Jane sinks into despondency when Rochester brings home a beautiful but vicious woman named Blanche Ingram. Jane expects Rochester to propose to Blanche, but Rochester instead proposes to Jane. Jane is at first skeptical of his sincerity, but eventually believes him and gladly agrees to marry him. She then writes to her Uncle John, telling him of her happy news. As she prepares for her wedding, a strange, savage-looking woman sneaks into her room one night and rips her wedding veil in two. Mr. Rochester attributes the incident to Grace Poole, one of his servants. The wedding day arrives, and as Jane and Mr. Rochester prepare to exchange their vows, the voice of Mr. Mason, a lawyer, cries out that Rochester already has a wife named Bertha and that she is still alive. Rochester does not deny Mason's claims, but he explains that Bertha has gone mad. The marriage ceremony is broken off, and Mr. Rochester takes the wedding party back to Thornfield, where they witness the insane Bertha Mason scurrying around on all fours and growling like an animal. Rochester keeps Bertha hidden on the third story of Thornfield and pays Grace Poole to keep his wife under control. Bertha was the real cause of the mysterious fire earlier in the story. Mr. Rochester asks Jane to go with him to the south of France and live with him as husband and wife, even though they cannot be married. Refusing to go against her principles and despite her love for him, Jane leaves Thornfield. Jane travels as far from Thornfield as she can, using the little money she had previously saved. But she becomes exhausted and hungry and at last is taken in by the Rivers family, who lives at Moor House. Very soon Jane becomes friends with the Rivers siblings, Diana, Mary and St. John Rivers. St. John becomes somewhat closer to Jane. He surprises her one day by declaring that her uncle John Eyre had died and left her a large fortune, £20,000. He shocks her further by declaring that her uncle was also his uncle. Jane and the Rivers are cousins. Jane immediately decides to share her inheritance equally with her three newfound relatives. Now, thinking that she will make a suitable missionary wife, St. John asks Jane to marry him and to go with him to India, not out of love but out of duty. Jane rejects the marriage proposal. However, she realizes that she cannot abandon forever the man she truly loves. One night, she hears Rochester's voice calling her name over the moors. Jane then turns to Thornfield to find only blackened ruins. She learns that Mr. Rochester's wife set the house on fire and committed suicide by jumping from the roof. In his rescue attempts, Mr. Rochester lost a hand and his eyesight. Jane reunites with him, but he fears that she will be repulsed by his condition. When Jane assures him of her love and tells him that she will never leave him, Mr. Rochester again proposes and they marry. He eventually recovers enough sight to see their firstborn son. This is the end of the story outline of the novel Jane Eyre. Thank you and have a nice day.